happy to introduce them, and they'll speak one after the other. So first, we have Gail Morgado, who is the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department for the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. Gail is a lead foreign affairs officer and has worked in conflict zones, including Honduras, Kenya, and South Sudan during her esteemed career at the State Department. She's also been a strong supporter from the beginning of our work in Colombia, a strong supporter of the Peace Accords Matrix team since serving in her role as the CSO director of the Office of the Western Hemisphere and European Eurasian Affairs. She's received a master's degree in foreign service at Georgetown University, where she concentrated in foreign policy and international security, and a BA in political science and Spanish from Rutgers University. So we're thrilled to have the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary here from CSO. And also with us is Daniel Avila Camacho. He's currently the Charge d'Affaires at the Embassy of Colombia here in Washington and an expert in disarmament and anti-personnel landmines. Mr. Avila began his diplomatic career at the Colombian consulate in Atlanta and later at the Colombian embassy in Jamaica. In the Chancellery, he became the coordinator of disarmament of the disarmament working group, focusing on issues of anti-personnel landmines, arms trafficking, and weapons of mass destruction. Between 2007 and 2010, Mr. Avila worked in the permanent mission of Colombia in the United Nations, where he worked on disarmament, security, and landmines. Mr. Avila studied communications at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and received a master's in international relations at the Universidad Javeriana. So I'd like to invite Deputy Assistant Secretary Morgado to the microphone.
Wonderful. Good evening, Deputy Chief of Mission, Dr. Echavarría, distinguished guests. It's an honor to be here with you today. Sincere honor. This marks 7 years of implementation of Colombia's peace accord. United States is a firm and enduring partner of the Colombian people on this journey toward a lasting peace. We are extraordinarily grateful for the Kroc Institute's outstanding work through the barometer, which illustrates the magnitude of what Colombia has achieved and the challenges that remain ahead. Standing here today, I am proud that we have 7 years of peace to build upon and to reflect. 578 provisions reflecting the hopes, the dreams, and the vision of a people in pursuit of peace and stability. Colombia's commitment to peace and our support of it, in particular through the accompaniment of the ethnic chapter, helped keep the 2016 agreement at the forefront of change. Kroc's real-time monitoring, this is a living document, pressing forward with advances at both the national and the community levels. With Kroc's expertise, these 7 years of implementation have provided a wealth of data, invaluable lessons to others seeking a lasting peace. What we're discussing today has impact far beyond Colombia's borders and shows to all those struggling to end conflict that peace is possible. Make no mistakes, the challenges are formidable. Armed actors, state presence, environmental degradation, inequality, justice, reconciliations, to name a few. We're going to discuss some of them today. At the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, or CSO for short, our strong partnership with Kroc has helped inform our focus on the root causes affecting violence and instability in Colombia that threaten peace implementation. We work closely with Afro-Colombians, Indigenous, and women leaders at the community level to continue the Peace Accord's unprecedented commitment to inclusion. A redoubled focus on the ethnic chapter and the needs of Colombia's most marginalized is essential to cementing hard-fought gains and preventing backsliding. Kroc's monitoring in as close to as real time as possible helps keep us honest and on track. Breaking new ground in how peace processes have been addressed, the Kroc Institute was given a mandate in 2016 Peace Accord to monitor implementation and to report its findings in real time. Very innovative, cutting edge, with information made available to the public. This mandate, the peace agreement matrix at the Kroc Institute's ongoing transparency and consultation make it a trusted broker and a reliable source of data and recommendations. That trust, combined with that real-time data, creates opportunities to course correct and to address areas of concern before it's too late. This is a tremendous opportunity. It's clearly blazing the trail for future peace agreements and opportunities to learn lessons outside of Colombia. CSO relies on Kroc's data to ensure our support of Peace Accord implementation remains responsive, timely, and relevant. And as I noted earlier, at the heart of our support is a focus on the Colombian people. Colombia's civil society is vibrant, it's diverse, it's determined, and it's innovative. Civil society was an essential component in ensuring the accord was more inclusive, more equitable, more representative of the populations affected by conflict. Ongoing advocacy by civil society and continuous vigilant monitoring of implementation keeps up the pressure to ensure even the thorniest of provisions is not forgotten. So these lessons, meaningful inclusion, rigorous monitoring, real-time accountability, have led to better and more sustainable outcomes. And as implementation continues, so should these essential elements. I'm very eager to hear from our distinguished panel and our guests from the Embassy of Colombia to explore in depth the challenges, opportunities, and lessons. Thank you for your time and for your commitment to building a more peaceful and safer future for all. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. It's great to see you. Gail, thank you so much for your opening remarks. And it's really great to see friends here, not only of the embassy, but of Colombia, whom we've worked for a very, very long time. So it's great to see you once again. On behalf of Ambassador of Colombia, Luis Gilberto Murillo, who's in Colombia right now, it is an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you, commemorating part of the celebration of the 7th anniversary of the Peace Accord 2016. We appreciate the support of the Kroc Institute in monitoring the implementation of the agreement. Through your steady dialogue, engagement with communities, victims, civil society, local leaders, and authorities, you have been able to gather lessons learned and good practices that are examples for the world and impact at the same time the implementation of the Peace Accord. So we just wanted to thank you once again for the tremendous job that you do and the whole team at the Kroc Institute. The government of Colombia, under the leadership of President Petro, took the step of recognizing the socioeconomic roots of armed conflict in Colombia. That's why on November 4th, 2002, the president signed into law the Total Peace Act, which regulates the framework and conditions under which dialogues and agreements with armed groups and criminal organizations can be conducted. To achieve lasting peace in Colombia, President Petro's administration is committed to working on 3 main lines of efforts. First and foremost, the full implementation of the 2016 Peace Accord, resuming dialogues and negotiations with the ELN, and a call for high-impact organized criminal structures to surrender to justice and put an end to their illicit activities. Regarding the 2016 Peace Accord, We are fully committed to the full implementation of the Accord 2016. I'd like to take a moment to appreciate and recognize and thank the government of the United States to contribute to its implementation. And Gail was addressing some of the issues in which we're closely working together on these issues, and hope to continue working closely with you, focusing on areas where implementation is most lagging. For example, the ethnic chapter of the Peace Accord. We appreciate the Biden's administration commitment to be the first international accompanier to the implementation of the ethnic chapter, as agreed by Secretary Blinken and Vice President Marquez last year in October 2022 in Bogota. We are currently developing a roadmap for this implementation. The peace agreement has been crucial to advance and achieve lasting peace and repair past harm and suffering in Colombia. We fully believe progress has been made in areas such as peace building, reintegration of former combatants, and transitional justice. However, we acknowledge that challenges remain. As far for the negotiations and dialogue with the ELN, the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace has also launched, as you are well aware, negotiations and dialogues with groups. And there have been 4 cycles already with the ELN that have taken place in Mexico, Cuba, and Venezuela. And as you quite know, tomorrow, December 1st, in Mexico, they will continue with the 5th cycle, in which they will initiate or focus on the issue and very sensitive issue of kidnapping. The process has the support of countries such as Cuba, Norway, Chile, Mexico, Brazil, and Venezuela, facilitators, support of the international community, which is important, and needless to say, the key important role that the UN verification mission in Colombia performs, as well as the Catholic Church. We have been building peace in Colombia for quite some time, amid enormous challenges that the country faces constantly. These include the refusal of some of the armed groups to negotiate and their continuing violence against communities in which they are located. That's why President Petro is very committed to making a great effort to bring lasting peace in the country. We must persist in building a culture of peace for years to come. And under the leadership of President Petro, we have established peace missions to listen and learn about the needs of the population and to propose remediation by government agencies, social organizations, representatives of the international community, and multilateral agencies. A continuing neutral and unarmed presence has been implemented to protect peace-building initiatives in rural and urban areas. The peace missions are located in Nariño, Chocó, and Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. And that's part of the efforts that the government continue to undertake to build this peace culture in the country. At the end, I just like to looking forward to the panel that continues and see how these peace efforts that the Colombian government is undertaking and how impacts the environment, how we're talking more about gender inequality, as Gail was mentioning. How do we address those issues? And that's the spirit that President Petro and the government of Colombia has behind the initiative of Total Peace. So we would like to thank the Kroc Institute for taking into account our participation. And we look forward to a very rich and engaging discussion with the experts and the panel to continue. And looking forward to the conclusions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Gail and Daniel, for your opening remarks. And thank you also to my co-panelists that have arrived already and for participating in this project, in this event. But above all, thank you all for coming here, for listening to us, for appreciating our contribution to this, as you both well have said, major effort in Colombia to make sure that this peace accord prevents the recurrence of violence. So I want to use the next 5 to 7 minutes to share with you just a short, brief status of current implementation. This is something that, as you know, the Kroc Institute is the official monitor of the implementation of the entire accord. We have been doing this work already since before the 1st of December 2016. We already started being part of the negotiation and providing technical support to the Havana table. And since we received the mandate in Chapter 6 of the Accord, what we have been doing is really creating a matrix, creating a methodology for tracking, doing the follow-up of how is the implementation of this very large peace accord going, but always with a very clear intention of improving implementation processes. In the last 7 years, we have presented 7 comprehensive reports. So in our reports, you find the whole year analysis of what has happened for all the 6 chapters of the agreement and the different transversal approaches. But we have also published 4 special reports on gender, 2 special reports of the ethnic approach. Last year, we had our first special report on victims' rights. And this year, we have published a very interesting report on the environmental aspects of peace accord implementation. For the first time, we're seeing how peace accords provisions with a direct and an indirect relationship to the environment are actually either affecting or being affected as the process of implementation advances. We found in that report that this set of commitments, if they were implemented, can support climate change mitigation, the conservation of ecosystems, the promotion of environmental health, and the participation guarantees for environmental issues. So we see here also this very clear nexus between the environment, climate, and peace building. When it comes to the status of implementation of the 2016 Peace Accord, we can report that it has not stopped in the past 7 years. It has, of course, become increasingly difficult to achieve the proposed objectives. Just to give you some data, in 2022, only 1% of the provisions changed their level of implementation. When in the first 2 years, so in 2017 and in 2018, 57% of the commitments underwent some changes. So, of course, there is a natural progression in the pace of implementation. The more you implement, the more difficult it becomes to have a gradual implementation change. But we also have to be honest and transparent and say that we need to make sure that we're pushing forward those long-term and territorially based action that require a great deal of resources and institutional capacity. So many of you know these graphs. What we see here, these are the last clean data that we have is until the 31st of October. So a month old, we have around 11% of the 578 stipulations that were not initiated. 38% are minimally implemented and 20% are at an intermediate level of implementation. This tells us overall 31% have already been completed. So what does this all mean when we look at in a more thematic way? These are the 6 chapters of the Accords. You can see 3 trends that we have been able to detect. The first one is that in the Chapter 3, which is the end of the conflict, and Chapter 6 on implementation, verification, and endorsement, we have the highest levels of implementation with more than 50% of those commitments already being completed. We have a second trend of implementation, point 4, on the solution to the problem of illicit drugs, and point 5, the agreement on victims have around 50% of the stipulations that are not on the track to be completed within the implementation timeline, which is originally scheduled until 2031, so 15 years of according to the framework plan. The third trend is for point 1, the comprehensive rural reform, and point 2 on political participation that show the lowest levels of implementation. So I hope that during the panel discussion, we have the opportunity to speak more in depth about these 3 trends. I just want to highlight a couple of advances, challenges, and opportunities that lie ahead. When we look at the first 7 years of implementation, we can say that the greatest advances were made by the laying down of weapons by the FARC-EP and the bilateral ceasefire. We have around 9,000 weapons, 1.7 million rounds of ammunition, among other types of war material that were surrendered. So if you do a lot of DDR programs and if you have the experience of other contexts, you realize that this is a very high level and rate of disarmament, so to say, for combatants. And 7 years after those programs were initiated, we still have around 12,000 of the 14,000 combatants that are still participating in reincorporation into social, political, and economic spheres of the country. The second largest advance that we've seen in the past 7 years is the required regulatory and institutional infrastructure for the implementation that has been established, which is a very positive sign for implementation to continue at a steady state if the Colombian government continues to prioritize implementation. We also look at the challenges, the bottlenecks, los cuellos de botella, those aspects that are really like creating problems, creating a lot of noise. The main challenge in the past 7 years has been other armed groups continuing to operate and newly emerged armed groups that have been created since the signing of the final accord. These groups continue to control some key territories and have prevented state institutions from being able to implement the accord. Another important implementation challenge has been the change in national, social, political, and economic scenarios. We have had 3 presidents already. So because I think that the Kroc Institute has also provided some kind of connecting tissue among different national administrations. But we now have a very different composition in the Colombian Congress. Twice has it changed since 2016. New local authorities have been re-elected already 3 times. We had the COVID-19 pandemic. Sometimes we forget what a great challenge that was. It was the first global pandemic where we could see how does the process of Peace Accord implementation behave during this pandemic. And of course, that changed a lot of the financial and institutional priorities for investment, also by the international community. And I just want to end with looking at the opportunities ahead. We believe there are numerous opportunities that still lie ahead to increase the implementation levels when we are now reaching a halfway point in the Accord's implementation timeline. We had just last April the approval of the National Development Plan and by the President's administration, and we were able to see how there have been a lot of diverse tools that were integrated into the National Development Plan in order to continue coordinating and continuing executing the implementation of the Peace Accord. And this plan is what is going to, in a way, direct resources and attention for the next 3 years. I mean, altogether 4 years. We have also seen in the 7th year of implementation, the action plans for the transformation of the 16 territorial PDET, the territorial development plans, subregions. They need to be updated. We think this is a great opportunity to update the framework plan indicators and to keep track of implementation within the 15-year timeline. And finally, we have also seen how the support of the international community has been fundamental. It has been an essential and key point to keep implementation going. The signatory parties, the communities in the territories most affected by the armed conflict, Colombian society have all benefited from technical, political, and financial cooperation of numerous states, and of course, international organizations and international cooperation agencies that have kept peace in Colombia a priority. And we hope that this great opportunity, of course, continues in the near future. All right. So thank you so much for your attention to this current status of implementation. I would like now to invite my co-panelists to come up here so we can start a discussion about what does all this evidence tells us about the current status of peace building in Colombia. Thank you so much. Right. So today with us, we have Cynthia Arnson. She's a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center and former director of its Latin American program. We have Steve Head from the United States Institute of Peace. He is the Colombia country director. Sinisha Vukovic from Johns Hopkins University, the SIIS director of the Global Policy Program. And last but certainly not least, Leslie Wingender. She is the director of peace building from Humanity United. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Great.
So we're going to kick things off with Cynthia. You have many years of experience in Colombia and have been an expert and directly engaged in and observing peace processes for quite some time and understand the historic cycles of violence, more so than a lot of people in this town. In light of the negotiation of the Peace Accord signed in 2016 and the 7 years that have gone by, what lessons do you see to highlight for the current negotiations that the administration in Colombia is undertaking?
Great. Well, Maura, thank you very much for this invitation. Thanks to the previous speakers for their reflections. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ELN negotiations which are underway. There is currently a ceasefire that is to last 6 months until the end of January, which I think is a positive development. And there have been additional positive developments during essentially the first year of the Petro administration. There has been a decrease in the rate of homicides nationally, a decrease in the levels of killing in the so-called PDETs, the zones that are identified for development programs, a slight decrease in forced displacement after a record number in 2022 of the civilian population, and fewer attacks on infrastructure. So I think that this is the sort of climate of total peace. Nonetheless, insecurity in the countryside is tremendous. The majority of fighting now goes on between and among illegal armed groups, not between those groups and the state. And I think that is a really key point. According to official figures, the number of confrontations between illegal armed groups, and I'm including not only those that have underlying political logics like the ELN, but also criminal groups, those confrontations are up by 85%. And at the same time, the confrontations between the forces of the state, principally the army and the police, the offensive actions by government forces have gone down by 47%. And therefore, and when I mentioned certain things had gone down, there has been an actual increase, a substantial increase in kidnappings and in extortion, and oftentimes the two things go together. I am not terribly optimistic about the peace talks with the ELN. The Petro administration is now the 7th Colombian administration since that of Cesar Gaviria to engage in peace talks. And I think the principal reason, and we'll come back to this, I think, throughout, is that the essential backdrop for evaluating this process has to do with the relationship between a military strategy or a security strategy and peace negotiations. A military strategy is not the only thing that is needed to conclude a successful agreement, but it is an indispensable element. And not only the decrease in security operations, but the perception that there is the lack of a security strategy and a desire to back away from a security strategy, I think, is a major impediment. Incentives for peace agreements have to be positive as well as negative. And military force is the most important component of those negative incentives. Another reason has to do with the ELN presence in Venezuela, where it is making huge amounts of money and controlling in the so-called arco minero, the mining arc, illegal gold mining. We can talk later in the discussion about the role of economic resources in making it harder to negotiate with violent actors. But the ELN's role, apparently hand in glove with the Venezuelan government in controlling these areas, is deeply worrisome. There has also been a growth of the ELN since the FARC demobilization. There are not only splinter groups of the FARC that did not demobilize and in which there have been attempts to negotiate under the Petro government, but the ELN benefited from the failure of the state to occupy the spaces that were abandoned by the FARC, and it grew supported by not only income from gold mining, but also from human trafficking. Another reason I'm skeptical is the ELN's ongoing role in kidnapping. And as Daniel Avila was pointing out, this will be the issue that will be tackled sort of as we speak. The delegations are arriving in Mexico. Despite the ceasefire, and despite the wording of that agreement that committed both the government and the ELN to respect the norms of international humanitarian law, the ELN insists that because it depends on kidnapping to gain resources, it is not obliged by the ceasefire to desist in these operations. And there was a case that sort of exploded into the headlines that thankfully has been resolved peacefully and with the physical safety and integrity of the person who was kidnapped, the father of Colombia's greatest most beloved soccer star after James, I would say, Luis Manuel Diaz, the father of Luis Diaz, who plays for the Selección Colombiana. And the kidnapping, I think, just erodes the support for peace negotiations in the eyes of public opinion. And that is deeply also, I think that's deeply concerning because it's what gives the Petro government the space. Now, I was going through some old files and I found a report from the International Crisis Group on negotiations with the ELN from more than 20 years ago, from 2002. And I would just like to read a very short recommendation that the ICG made to the ELN. And they called on the ELN in order to make peace negotiations more possible to accept the principle of a ceasefire and the cessation of all hostilities, including kidnapping, prior to the initiation of substantive peace agreements, also to demonstrate goodwill by an early release of kidnapping victims that it was holding. A lot of water under the bridge, and the ELN is still engaging in this practice. We will see if an agreement on kidnapping comes out of this current round of talks. If it does, I think that will be a major advance. And then the final element that I would emphasize before stopping and opening the floor for my other co-panelists is that the structure of the ELN, I think, also raises questions about the ability to achieve a peace settlement. It is very decentralized. For a long time, there has been the concern that the COSE, the Comando Central, does not control these different units. And you saw that in the kidnapping of Manuel Diaz, that the ELN came out and recognized that it was an error and it had been committed by one of its fronts, but it was a way of sort of saying, hey, don't blame this on us. It was these folks out in the field. So that these geographically dispersed units are something that makes it sort of questionable whether or not there will be the ability to bring the whole thing, to negotiate a peace. And again, looking back over 21 years, the ICG pointed out that it remains an open question whether the ELN's high command has the necessary unity and control over the rebel fronts dispersed across the whole of Colombia. The absence of a functioning chain of command and diverging interests and viewpoints have made it difficult to build a solid consensus on how to achieve peace in the past. So it's not always the case that history dictates the future, but I think that people have been at it for long enough in Colombia with the ELN that some of these historic concerns are still highly relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Steve, you are another person who is very closely engaged with the implementation of the 2016 Accord and been tracking it closely. Specifically on the critical yet politically sensitive issue of transitional justice and USIP's close collaboration both with the Truth Commission and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, how would you assess the current and upcoming challenges related to the Accord's aspirations to merge elements of both the punitive and restorative justice for war crimes committed by guerrillas and government security forces during the armed conflict?
Thank you very much for the question. And I suggested to have a chance to talk a little bit about the transitional justice chapter 5, because there's so much, and Kroc has done such great work in identifying a lot of those bottlenecks, a lot of those technical challenges in the implementation of rural reform, of political participation, of counter-narcotics and alternative development. But I think, and there are a lot to be said about that and a lot to be improved. But I do think it's worth a moment, a reflection on the hopeful nature of what has been achieved in the implementation of transitional justice as a result of the 2016 Peace Accord with the FARC. I want to start this is the first year which you had kind of a full year without the Truth Commission existing as a whole. And I think it's worth noting, last year, in commemorations on the 6th anniversary, really looking at the importance of the work of the Truth Commission, all that it meant in terms of the dignification of victims across the country, that not only just the volumes and history that was written there that is so essential for historical memory for the country, but also all of the engagements and all the methodology that was really developed by the Truth Commission. I think you can't look at the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement in all of its facets, really celebrating what was achieved during those 3.5, almost 4 years. Now, that was the aspiration was this doesn't end simply with the culmination of a report. And we've had the opportunity to look at what has been the legacy of that commission and its spirit living on beyond just the commission itself. And I think there's a lot of things to really celebrate in that. I think there's been a lot of spaces. We've had the fortunate enough opportunity to contribute to some of those spaces and accompany some of those spaces of handing out the physical actual volumes of the report to victims groups, to civil society organizations, to the armed forces, to different training schools of the armed forces, so that this is not an exercise that was seen politically through a political lens. There was a lot of criticism of some of the recommendations of the final report itself. And I think the exercise is more in the spirit of what that meant for a society which says we will dialogue with one another, we will engage with one another, we will include a whole range of diverse voices. And I don't think there's enough that can be said to really say how important that is for broader aspirations of reconciliation. And that was really fundamentally at the spirit of, beyond the technical, immense technical aspirations of the final peace agreement. I think there are broader spiritual and reconciliation aspirations of the Accord that were embodied by the Truth Commission's report. So I think there's a lot to be said, a lot to be celebrated about what's been achieved in this last year. And President Petro said, we're going to take the letter of these recommendations, we're going to implement them. And there's a monitoring committee that's responsible for doing that to see how they're being implemented. They've released their first report. I think that was a good opportunity to sort of take stock. I think a lot of people also sort of understood that even the commissioners themselves, one of whom works on our USIP team in Colombia, Leonard Palacios, will say these recommendations were really meant with a spirit of opening and continuing the debate in society, continue to have conversations amongst key actors in society. And so I think that when you look at very sensitive issues like military doctrine reform, that was a part of that. Even core aspects of the current peace policy of negotiating with armed groups, even criminal organizations. Those things were embedded in those recommendations from the Truth Commission, which said the 2016 Peace Accord won't be able to be implemented in a lot of Colombian territory if we don't have proactive, non-coercive, complementary solutions and processes with armed groups in many of these territories. So there's a lot to be still celebrated from those recommendations. So I think just on that, I wanted to just then transition to the Transitional Justice Court itself, the HEB, which internationally, there hasn't been an experience in which an armed actor has negotiated its own submission to be tried and prosecuted for war crimes. This doesn't exist in any other international experience. The FARC were the first to accept and negotiate their own prosecution. And I think that's incredibly important in the comparative perspective internationally. Now, how that has been actually implemented in incredibly innovative ways, groundbreaking indictments for war crimes. I mean, there are multiple macro cases, but just the most important ones being for extrajudicial killings on the one hand, committed by the armed forces, and kidnappings by the FARC, who, as Cynthia pointed out, in the ELN process, the history of kidnappings in Colombia has a long and traumatic experience politically and socially. And in these two cases, you've had really deeply moving hearings that in no other transitional justice context or mechanism in the world have allowed for victims and perpetrators to engage in both quiet, private, and public hearings of acknowledgement of responsibility. We've had a chance to be a part of those, some of those processes, and it really can attest to the genuine nature of the satisfaction of victims in the contrition that they've felt being expressed by perpetrators, which is often more of a satisfaction to than simply jail sentences. And now we're at a very critical point of waiting for what those actual sentences will be, at least on those two very, very symbolic and important cases. We hope in the first months of next year, 2024, we will have the HEP will announce the first alternative sanctions or alternative sentences that will try to weave a very fine line between punitive measures and restorative measures. And this is also an aspiration that no other transitional justice process has tried to achieve. So 7 years later, and we're at this really culminating moment for restorative justice in a transitional justice environment. There's going to be major challenges, and I'll just point out a couple of those, but major challenges on the expectations of proportionality, of whether those sentences will be sufficiently proportional to the extent of the war crimes for which they are being tried and have accepted responsibility in those two major cases. questions of the compatibility with the sentences outside of what we call non-custodial sentences outside of prison walls, whether those activities that they will be carrying out as a part of those sentences are truly correspond to the damage that they committed or created and the harm that they committed through their crimes. I think victims will want to see that, but it is a formula that is really elusive and very challenging, particularly when you think about these types of activities, restorative justice activities and sanctions require funding and they require projects and programs, and no one wants to necessarily provide financing for perpetrators of war crimes so that they can restore through their own activities and through their time in community work victims. But it is absolutely essential. So these are really on the cusp of a really important point for Colombian history. I think if no one is going to be completely satisfied, but I can attest to the process up until now has truly been healing for a lot of communities and been transformative in many ways for perpetrators. Particularly public members of the army and the police that have engaged in these processes have found it to be their ability to accept responsibility and engage with victims and hear and truly listen and dignify victims to be transformational for themselves, and have created a set of unexpected peace builders that I think are going to be really crucial moving forward, and who can have really strong voices for other current processes, whether it's the ELN, FARC dissidents, or other perpetrators of egregious human rights violations.
Thanks, Steve. Sinisa, you have great experience in questions of conflict management, more specifically on negotiations with criminal groups. And post-conflict violence, beyond Colombia. Which would you identify are the emerging trends in peace building when it comes to questions of criminal groups and more intransigent actors? How confident are you that these processes can reach or yield positive outcomes in Colombia?
Thank you for the question. So, I've picked up a lot of insights from my co-panelists, so I'll try to build on what they've said. We're here because we care, right? So we care how the peace building process is going on. And for us, it should be a priority. And this is something that we believe everyone should pay attention to. But just a year ago, when I took students to Colombia, we were confronted with a very surprising piece of information, and that is when there was a public survey of what the public sentiment is about the peace building process. It was fourth on the list, or even lower. Maybe I'm giving it too much visibility, but it's not in top three. I remember that vividly. And it means that peace building processes in general operate within a very complex social system. So they are not operating in a vacuum. They are confronted with other social dynamics, and for many members within the societies that have to endure the process of peace building, many will actually contest the prioritization of certain policies over those ones that they believe need to be implemented. We're talking about 7 years of implementation. So some people just want to prioritize other policies that are not directly related to the peace building platform and plan that is currently in Colombia. And that this is the biggest challenge of peace building. That peace building, just to put it in simple terms, does not operate in a vacuum. Peace building is an integral part of social development, of state building. So Colombia, even though where it was a very consolidated democracy, in many parts of its own territory was in the process of consolidation, or, and I hope I'm not overstepping with this tone, or absent from some parts of its territory. So now it's in the process of reasserting its presence in those territories. So it's a state building process. So now when we think about the challenges of peace building in a complex situation such as the Colombian one, the reality is that we have very little to work from when it comes to understanding who are or what are the spoiling mechanisms in peace building. Because when it comes to peace processes, we're very good at detecting spoilers. We know who are those actors that can spoil the ongoing negotiation process, and we know how to handle them depending on what they actually do and what they stand for. But when it comes to peace building, which is the post-agreement phase, where you're trying to implement it within a complex social structure, understanding what spoils, why, and when becomes very elusive. Because these actors may not do it intentionally. They may be doing it because it's their political preference. They may be doing it by inertia. They may be doing it without even knowing it. And that is still nonetheless derailing or completely undermining the qualities of the peace building implementation. So when we think about peace building and use Colombia as a remarkable example, we need to start understanding whatever we design as a peace building plan, it needs to match the realities of the overall society, not just of the peace process. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is that because peace building doesn't operate in a vacuum, it still creates a vacuum. It created a vacuum after the DDR process, or throughout the DDR process, where you had certain types of predatory actors who capitalized on the security gap that existed with the DDR of FARC forces and the inability of the state to reassert its presence in a comprehensive, not just securitizing way. And those actors, as Cindy was mentioning, are truly undermining the quality of the peace implementation process for their own gain. Now, one of the things about these actors, and I'm going to focus, as your question was, on criminal gangs. One of the uniqueness of these actors is that they are apolitical. So again, from general knowledge of peace processes, we know how to mainstream those intransigent groups that still have some political platform to work on, right? So that is why talking to ELN is very different than talking to Bakrim, because ELN at least has an ideological manifesto, some form of policy that they are at least on a kind of declarative level trying to express, whereas these groups couldn't care less. So for them, the politics are secondary to the opportunities of exploiting the vulnerabilities of the current situation. When we think about what needs to be done in order to mainstream them, or should they be mainstream, is to understand their connection to the local populations, because that's the key in understanding mainstreaming of the most difficult groups. If they lack connection to the local realities, if they lack connection, if they lack a desire to be representative of something greater than themselves, meaning the local populations, they will not be mainstreamed, and they need to be confronted. But if they have some degree of connection, that is an opportunity to change their ways if, again now, peace building process goes properly. And that is, peace building delivers on the promises of others so that no one wants to be recruited, mobilized into joining those groups that are outside of the process. So as I said, this is the theory of complexity. You know, one piece pulls the other in. So if you do not deliver on the promise to FARC, it doesn't relate only to FARC. It relates to all of the other ones sitting outside who say, why should I even care about anything of this kind? Because they're not even delivering on to them. So the challenges of peace building is that, and I think, so maybe I've been critical for until this point, Colombia is the most robust peace building process that we have seen to date. Colombia is the most ambitious process that we have seen to date. Colombia is the most elaborate process that we have seen to date. So there's a lot to be learned from the Colombian experience. Yet the Colombian experience is confronted with some of the most unsurmountable challenges because there are multiple conflicts happening at the same time, where you're trying to implement such a robust peace process. And of course, the weak spots will emerge as soon as you do not deliver on the promises. So that chart should be a reminder that as soon as you start being delayed in the implementation, that is a signal to those ones outside of the process that the process is not really an opportunity for them to exploit. Now, the last point that I would like to make about these groups in particular is that it really depends on our diagnosis. And I always say this to my students, and I see that there are also students here and non-expert community. When we talk about these criminal gangs, criminal groups, we need to understand, what are we referring them as? Are we talking about them as a socioeconomic phenomenon or a security issue? Because departing from that diagnosis, we will start designing policies of how to handle. And you can actually see that type of dichotomy. And I'm not implying it's a dichotomous issue, but you can see that once you start talking about them in a certain way, policies follow. And you will have, depending, so if it's a purely security problem, you have El Salvador, right? But if you can actually rethink the priority of having them only be associated with a security issue, you may have something as ambitious as Colombia has at this point. So this is where the challenge starts, is to kind of, how do you move away from the most conservative, traditional, rigid way of thinking about these groups, and that is that they are only and primarily a security issue. Thank you.
Leslie, this Sinisa set you up very nicely because you work for a very influential foundation, Humanity United, which is focused on a great variety of philanthropic endeavors when it comes to grassroots peace building, and specifically processes that are led by civil society to build peace around the reconstruction of relationships, which I think is related very much to this issue of how groups are diagnosed. How do you see the Colombia experience tying into this broader strategy of communal and civil society relationships?
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to the panelists, your comments. I've been running through examples, ideas, thinking about, actually, I've been asking at each point of your excellent points is like, who's already doing this and who's mobilizing around this? And I think that's one of the greatest things at working at Humanity United, is being able to support different organizations, individuals, people in Colombia and around the world that are thinking about this differently and trying out new things to really move our field forward in peace building, and to move forward in each of the contexts where they're working to a better and more sustainable society and context of peace. So for Colombia in particular, I think we at Humanity United have strategies, as all donors and organizations do. But that strategy was not based in a room by ourselves. It was based on the conversations, the validations, the strategy sessions we had with partners in Colombia and around the world, in South Sudan, in Mali, pulling those experiences into informing how we think about inclusive peace processes and how we support inclusive peace processes, how we build agency for collective action, how we think about innovative ways for breaking out of the traditional ways of doing peace building, and also how we think about well-being and healing, which is absolutely critical for the people who are working on this at all the different levels. So for Colombia, I think, hearing also your last comment, Sinisa, I think the complexity of the relationships and how we act is absolutely key. In Colombia, I think the phrase, ¿para qué hacerlo fácil si difícil también se puede? It is like the mantra, but why would we do this easily if we could also do this difficultly? If the hard way is also an option. So, but I think I'm thinking about, what's so fascinating about Colombia is like how active each of these pieces are. I think about absolutely almost to the day 8 years ago, meeting Laurel Quinn, thinking about in 2015 how we were going to monitor the peace agreement for Colombia, thinking what that would look like. I mean, she's sitting with Mateo and Angela, who are an amazing team of the barometer, that team has turned into something different that was never imagined. Like we never imagined, you know, the Peace Accord matrix was an analytical tool, and now it is an active tool where you are talking with different actors in the government and in comunes and different actors in the field, now using the barometer to reach different regions. And what does that look like? What does it mean to be implementing the peace agreement in the Chocoan area, in Montes de Maria? Like you're thinking about that differently and in a localized lens, because at the national level, it's one thing, but on the local level, what is that materializing into? And what are those challenges specific? What are we seeing? And therefore who, maybe not the barometer team, because that's not their mandate, but who and what women's groups, other civil society, you know, how do we advocate to the mayors to in the budgeting process as we think about pushing and continuing the implementation? I think other things about Colombia that really stand out is with what the Truth Commission, just as Steve was highlighting, has just finished its mandate. One of the learnings from the peace agreement and how comprehensive it was, but how do you carry that forward into society and discuss it, was a really challenging year in 2016, right? The polarization within society around the peace agreement. And so with the Truth Commission, also recognizing there was misinformation, there was, you know, different narratives about it. How do you talk about it? How do you grapple with it? How do we not make this, you know, one side or the other? And so that was already, the Colombians were already learning from their own experience in order to make sure that we can't let this commission fall with just a report. This needs to be an ongoing discussion, not to just promote it and say it's the best, but really grapple with it. And now we have the honor at HU to be supporting the group, you know, the allies. Like there are 3,800 organizations around the country that are continuing to grapple with and push forward the recommendations of the Truth Commission. And those recommendations, 60% of them relate to the implementation of the peace agreement. So these are not outside of what already was set up. It's an incredible story of like active, you know, circles, not a linear process in the post-accord. As you know, you were saying, we're in post-accord, but how do we act in that? Well, it's perpetual peace building, right? And how do we start continuing to like push at different critical moments? So as a foundation, Colombia is an opportunity for us to really support and enhance the ecosystem of actors who are already working in that, and as well pull those lessons out into other spaces, as well as other spaces, you know, informing and encouraging the peace builders in Colombia.
Thank you, Leslie. We're going to move fast through one more round of questions and make sure we leave time for any questions from all of you, because we have a absolutely delightful reception waiting for all of us. Because this is, while the Peace Accord implementation very much continues, this is a moment of recognition that it has been 7 years and a lot of work has been done. So we do have a lovely reception waiting for all of us. So we will briskly move through another round of questions with this esteemed panel.
Positive incentive.
Right. Positive incentive.
There you go.
I like that.
A little advocacy.
Obviously, this discussion could go on much longer, but we'll move briskly through some other questions and then see if anyone in the audience wants to jump in. So, Josefina, lessons learned. Everyone has acknowledged this is an incredible, comprehensive agreement, historic at this juncture in terms of peace processes underway or possibly coming in other parts of the world. At this juncture, what are the key lessons based on the monitoring that you've done in Colombia?
Thank you, Maura. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I mean, we have analyzed some of those key lessons. We have a very nice policy brief on lessons learned from Peace Accord design and implementation, and we highlight questions like the victim-centered approach that allows for a great ownership of Peace Accord implementation, not only by the signatory parties or the former combatants, but also by civil society organizations. I do believe that for example, the success of the Truth Commission's work, from what Steve was saying, what Leslie was also echoing, can only be understood when we look at the demands of victims organizations, civil society organizations already from the 90s. But I think that one of the other key lessons that we knew already from PAM, this analytical tool, was we know that hybrid mechanisms for peace accord implementation really improve implementation. So we know that having not just the signatory parties that were, fighting for the past 60 years. Somebody takes out the 2002 report that, well, we already said that 21 years ago, and you still haven't done it. So between the signatory parties or between conflict parties, you have great mistrust even after you go through negotiations and you're able to sign a peace accord. So having third-party monitors, having civil society organizations, the international community, academia, the UN missions, etc., monitor the implementation, provides trust to the conflict parties. It provides transparent information, what Gail was highlighting in her remarks. And that overall creates a better implementation. So we have better coordination of implementation agencies' efforts. We have an easier way, more transparent way of prioritizing and deciding funding decisions by the international community, but also by the own state, which has suffered through armed conflict. And so it has to make almost like zero-sum games when it comes to security, so social, political, economic development. And we're very happy because we just received the mandate, similar mandate in the Philippines, in this case for in the region of Mindanao, to monitor the implementation of the normalization annex of the Bangsamoro Accord. So we are seeing how peace builders, conflict parties interested in negotiation, mediators, facilitators are looking at this particular case and saying, this is not a copy-paste question. This is a model from which we can learn. We can learn the good lessons that we can transfer to our countries. So I think that having third-party monitors is something we're seeing replicated and transferred to our context. Thank you.
Thank you. Sanisa, also along the lines of lessons learned, the 2016 Accord, its design was incredible in many ways. It brought together ethnic, gender, territorial perspectives. It's a relation design implementation. But what lessons are there from that design? Is it too complicated? There's actually been a lot of challenges. It's very sophisticated. What would you draw from that design of the 2016 Accord for other contexts?
So again, trying to be as succinct as possible. Designing a peace process occurs in a particular time. And what we're expecting is that those people actually have such foresight to know what's the world going to look like in 10 years. So we're putting too much expectation on the design already to kind of meet all of the challenges that emerge in the meantime. No one could anticipate COVID, for instance. No one could anticipate the current political landscape in Latin America, because the news travels fast in the region. So the shifting gears between left and right, and how policies are being implemented. But if we think about the design process in any peace negotiations, we can actually see that many times, if you really want to step outside of the comfort zone and you only try and not focus on only meeting the immediate demands of the conflicting parties, but trying to understand the broader social implications of the peace process, you will inevitably include into that design elements, norms, principles, and even beliefs that are exogenous to specifically those conflicting parties, but also potentially to the society at large. So the issues that you just raised when it comes to ethnic, gender, territorial, they were inherent in the conflict, but they were not seen as such by the conflicting parties or by the society at large. The conflict was never discussed through those lenses prior to the peace agreement. Yet after the peace agreement was signed and throughout the implementation of the peace process, and especially thanks to the TRC, you could actually see a new narrative emerging about how to best understand the conflict, the legacies of conflict, what the society stood for and should stand for. And I think that the more hybrid and the more elaborate, ambitious the scope is, of course, more challenges will emerge, but it gives more opportunities for a more fluid, adaptable system, so that you can move pieces easily. So you don't need to invent the peace process over and over again. I come from a region that has been poised by an agreement that is very comprehensive, but is very rigid. The Dayton Peace Accords in Bosnia. I mean, that country is still paralyzed because of the way the peace agreement was designed, because they couldn't care less about what the world is going to look like in 10 years. And we're 27 years after the peace agreement, and the conflict is still very much living in the hearts and minds of the people. This agreement is not as such. This agreement, because of its scope, ambition, and ability to integrate norms that were outside of the comfort zone, allowed for further rethinking of the priorities of the society. So it comes with multiple challenges that no one really wants to take on their own, but at the same time gives more opportunities. One of the opportunities, and I just recalled it from my conversation with the TRC, is that the TRC has set up a new narrative about who Colombians are, what Colombia is, and how to look at the past to understand what the future is going to look like. That is not something that the TRCs have managed in a neat and clear-cut way in other experiences. And I think that this is a lesson learned for everyone in the future, to know if Colombia succeeds, this is a remarkable benchmark for the future on the global scale.
Steve, one of the methodological evolutions in the negotiation strategy of the current Colombian administration has been the embrace of carrying out partial agreements prior to completing final accords with armed groups. How can these efforts build upon the 2016 Peace Accord implementation in specific territories which continue to be affected by ongoing armed conflicts?
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, the FARC negotiations between the Santos administration were based upon a methodology that nothing was agreed to until everything was agreed, right? And so we do have then the final agreement, and then this long period of 15 years of implementation. And we see a huge advantage of that in the context of the leverage that provided in the negotiations table. But looking back on some of the challenges of implementation and some of the progress that could have been made prior to the disarmament of the FARC on major things like rural reform, which was one of the earlier points that was agreed to at the negotiations table, has led to sort of a rethinking of that across the region. And the Norwegian facilitation in the Venezuelan talks is based upon the idea that we'll begin implementing things even prior to having a comprehensive agreement. And what are the benefits of that? Part of that is, let's begin to sort of build trust. Let's pilot things that can be viable. Let's ground macro aspirational ideas that could be very transformative, but maybe too difficult to implement, by trying to do things very pragmatically in the short term, so that what we agree to at the end is really more pragmatic, more grounded in really realities of what's going on. So I just point that out. I think there's a broader, we don't have time to go through all of this, but there's a broader sort of tension within the peace community in Colombia between those that are very deeply committed, and as all of us here, I think in this room, deeply committed to the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement. And that we believe that this is the sort of the cornerstone of any future ones, all for the reasons of transformation in certain parts of the country, but also confidence building that the government can fulfill it and deliver. But this is, and those the other side that say, you know, we're going to really prioritize these new negotiations. I think it was unfortunate some of the mixed messaging that took place in Colombia this past week, in which President Petro did not show up. No one from the government administration showed up to the commemoration celebration in Bogota that we had a chance to be a part of convening. And it sent the message that no, you know, we're really only prioritizing these new processes, and somehow the peace agreement with the FARC is something related to President Santos. I think one of the ways of overcoming this false dichotomy between is it one or the other, which shouldn't be at all a choice, is through this idea of partial agreements, and that agreements that, whether it's the two major processes where there are talks, full delegations from the government, outside of Medellin and Buenaventura, which are urban provinces, but with the FARC dissident groups of the Estado Mayor Central and Mordisco, and with the ELN. You have full delegations in both of those delegations, and the methodology of those processes adopt this idea of partial agreements that would be implemented on the ground in territories affected by ongoing armed conflict. One of the main things is leveraging what has already been in the process of the PADET, which are territorial development plans, incredibly inclusive, groundbreaking in terms of participation, a lot of consensus around pragmatic things and priorities in these regions. So there shouldn't be negotiations that go back and say, what are we going into those municipalities, and we're going to create a whole nother participatory process. Now, that's for the ELN, which would like to have its own participatory process, and has already begun a participatory process, which I think is very important for their own psyche, who have been sort of felt like the little brothers of the FARC for so many years. But the real key is saying this is what is already funded in these areas. This is something that the government can begin to say. If it's in Catatumbo, for example, with the ELN, the PADET process has prioritized a number of things around internet access, around green technologies, around a university in Catatumbo. These should be the things that the government is saying, we will do this in part of the ELN process. We're going to accelerate this with additional funding. And so there can be some synergizing between these processes. That they're not competitive processes. They shouldn't be juxtaposed as it's one or the other. Again, the ELN and the FARC dissidents will say, we don't want anything to do with the 2016 peace agreement. But that that in the end, these are the activities. They have consensus with communities. They have funding by the government. They have legitimacy, and they need to be a part of the negotiations, even if you're not referring to them explicitly as we're implementing this agreement, and therefore we're going to offer this to the ELN. That's probably not something the ELN is going to accept. But in the practicality on the ground, this is also something that's also going to assuage those that fear that an ELN agreement, or even worse, FARC dissident agreement, would somehow overshadow the importance of this monumental 2016 agreement. And that's if we can make these processes around much more pragmatic, less macro reforms, and much more grounded governance reforms, those will be really, really, really critical. And then the last thing I'll just say is the complementarity of a national accord, a national pact amongst all diverse sectors of society is something that's very critical to both the ELN and the FARC dissident negotiations. That's something that wasn't a part of the FARC agreement. It was based upon the assumption that we can move forward with 51% of a referendum vote, which we have all learned to embrace that that's not going to be sufficient. Right? A polarized society is not one in which we can implement massive reforms that the government of Colombia and its people have needed for decades. So if these smaller negotiations that are more grounded in realities on the ground can then complement a broader national pact, which President Petro has fortunately continued to reiterate. Last week met with business leaders, again, on this idea of a national pact, met with political opposition of President Alvaro Uribe. These are incredibly important statements to the aspirations of reconciliation, which the FARC agreement from 2016 really laid out and sought to achieve.
Great. I've got one quick question for Leslie as a follow-up, and then we'll let Cynthia bring us home. Leslie, this ultimately, to state the obvious, is about people, everyday people in their lives. And your organization, you work as a catalyst for a lot of local engagement. So whether it's specifically in Colombia or more broadly, how does that interplay with regional and sub-regional approaches that maybe other international actors are engaged in?
Thank you. I think what's interesting is, again, it's about people, and I think also understanding what position you're in. And I'm a part of a foundation. It's an American foundation. We have the privilege to partner with organizations in different countries and different contexts, but always coming in and recognizing the power dynamics that exist in those relationships. I think we are a funder, and the current system of financing is deeply overly puts the power and the decision making on someone like myself or my colleagues, and how we switch that type of thinking when those who are closest to the situation and are actually already doing the work have the answers already. Going back to us creating a strategy in our own room is not where we need to be being, right? And I think in this room, we have policymakers, we have bilateral actors, we have foundations, we have experts. Like we all work in this network, right? And so, like Sinisa, you were talking about the complexity. It's like really understanding the different positions that we're in, and I think that always coming forward with a posture of accompaniment. That's a philosophy that we've taken as a foundation. Is like, let me walk alongside you in this. Let's engage in this, and let me leverage what I might have, whether it's finances or other types of resources. Being in this space, I get to talk about this, the Colombian process. I'm wearing Manifiesta. It is an ex-combatant initiative where they have created this amazing fashion, right? And so like this to me, like, these small things are like getting to represent the amazing work and efforts of so many others. So I would just highlight the importance of recognizing how we show up, recognizing the power that we have, and being really transparent about that when we're engaging in these different types of scenarios, and really leveraging that network, because I think that's a transformed way of working in the peace building field.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. So Cynthia, you gave us a lot to worry about in your opening comments, to be honest.
Okay.
I think I might have even started sweating. I was like, oh my God, I'm so worried. Yeah. But maybe at this point in the conversation, you've got more to suggest on a maybe win-win.
Yes.
Can the total peace process and the 2016 Peace Accord implementation, can they both happen? Give us some hope.
Yes, I would like to. Okay, I realize I'm the only thing standing between you and your snacks, so I'm going to be very quick. All right, just a couple of ideas to summarize. Picking up on what Steve said, the 2016 Accord had as a principle, or just as a basic principle, that nothing was agreed to until everything was agreed to, as a way of providing pressure and leverage. That needs to be rethought, because there are other examples of peace processes in Latin America, most notably El Salvador, where a previous humanitarian agreement that was verified by the UN served as a sort of stepping stone on the path to a larger peace agreement. And I think that if the ELN and the Colombian government can, with the facilitation of all of the friends in the UN, negotiate a humanitarian accord, that would go a long way, not only to relieving the suffering of people in these conflict zones, but also building trust in the process. Second point, I think it's critical to implement the 2016 agreement in order to make these other processes credible and possible. The government needs to demonstrate its will and its capacity to implement what is signed at a negotiating table, for others to find that a credible process, not only for the sake of the communities that are affected by ongoing violence, for the former combatants that are trying to rebuild their lives, but also so that the groups that are still at war believe that negotiations are a way forward. So I find it troubling when I look at Josefina's, bar charts, that the chapters on rural reform, which is one of the central historic issues in Colombia, and the issue on political participation, are the farthest back. So the implementation process does need to go forward. Third, I would say that with respect to transitional justice, it's going to be very difficult with the ELN process or other partial processes with former FARC groups, not so much with the narco trafficking and criminal groups, to have less than you had with the FARC. It will be very, very difficult, and people don't necessarily want to be a carbon copy, but I'm not sure how you will ever convince the Colombian public to endorse this agreement unless these mechanisms that were condemned as very insufficient at the beginning, are in some sense replicated. And then finally, I'll go back to where I began, which is that there is a need for greater clarity on the relationship between peace negotiations with political groups such as the ELN or dissident FARC, and even negotiations with criminal groups, the relationship between those negotiations and a security strategy. And I just don't see that that is present in this government. And I think it's a really important, it's important in its absence. Tanisha and I have a common mentor in Bill Zartman, who's one of the ultimate gurus of conflict resolution and conflict mediation. There's this concept of a herding stalemate. And, you know, it's not an objective thing. It's not something that, you know, you can sort of say, you know, this guy's got his nose bloodied and that person has its nose bloodied, and therefore, you know, there's a stalemate. It's in people's heads. It's a perception that your future is going to be better, that you are going to be more able to realize your goals in peace than through war. And you cannot get to that without a military and security strategy. Thank you.
Josefina, do you want to, I don't think we have time for questions. You all can chat with this panel during the reception. Do you want to give us a final send off, Josefina?
Thank you so very much. Thank you for your attention. Thank you to my panelists, of course, moderator and the greatest host that I've met in a very long time, Maura. I just wanted to mention that all of our reports, including these charts and the environmental reports, are on our website. You're more than welcome to download them and engage with us, send us questions. We would be really happy to talk with you more about it. I also want to thank all our co-sponsors of this wonderful event, starting, of course, with the Wilson Center, Johns Hopkins University, USIP, Humanity United, so co-panelists and participantes activos, of course, to our wonderful partners of CSO. Thank you so much to the Colombian Embassy for being here, accompanying all of us here. And